I never thought my quiet Saturday morning would turn into a neighborhood legend, but that's what happens when you live under an HOA that attracts power-hungry busybodies like moths to a porch light. The sun had barely climbed over the trees when I stepped outside with my coffee, planning to grab a few jars of potatoes from my old root cellar. That cellar had been on my property since before the HOA even existed, grandfathered in, documented, and approved, though Keran never liked that fact. Keran was the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood. She wasn't technically on the HOA board anymore, but that never stopped her from acting like she owned everyone's land. She measured lawns with a ruler, photographed trash cans, and once reported my bird feeder for unauthorized wildlife encouragement. So when I noticed movement near the cellar door, my stomach dropped. At first I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it. But then I saw her. Keran, bent over, jiggling the latch. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm like she was on official business, even though she clearly wasn't. I froze, watching as she looked over her shoulder and then pried the door open just enough to squeeze inside. I stood there in disbelief. This wasn't common area. This wasn't HOA property. This was my land. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel, and heard her rummaging inside. Glass jars clinked, boxes shifted. That was when anger replaced shock. I called out her name, but she didn't respond. Either she didn't hear me or she chose not to. That's when I made a decision. I stepped forward and quietly shut the cellar door. The latch slid into place with a solid click. I didn't lock it, just closed it firmly. Then I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. I explained calmly that someone had unlawfully entered a private structure on my property and was currently inside. As I waited, I could hear Keran pounding on the door from within. Her muffled voice rose from irritation to outrage in under 30 seconds. She screamed about HOA violations, inspections, and her authority, none of which mattered anymore. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt oddly calm. Keran had crossed a line, literally and legally, and I wasn't going to save her from the consequences. The sirens in the distance told me this was only the beginning. By the time the patrol car rolled into the cul-de-sac, Keran had escalated from pounding to full-on shrieking. Neighbors began peeking through blinds and stepping onto porches, drawn out by the noise like spectators to a slow-motion disaster. I stayed by the cellar, phone in hand, recording everything. Experience had taught me that documentation was the only real defense against HOA nonsense. When the officers stepped out, Keran immediately switched tactics. The moment they opened the cellar door at my request, she burst out, red-faced and furious, launching into a breathless monologue about inspections, safety violations, and her duty to the community. She pointed at me like I'd committed a felony by inconveniencing her. The officers listened politely, then asked the one question Keran clearly wasn't prepared for. "Ma'am, do you have permission to be on this property?" Keran sputtered. She claimed implied authority, HOA oversight, emergency inspection rights, phrases she'd probably weaponized for years. I handed the officer my property survey, HOA bylaws, and prior written confirmation that the root cellar was exempt and private. The officer nodded slowly as he reviewed them. Keran's confidence drained in real time. The second officer asked her why she hadn't notified the homeowner or the HOA board. Keran responded that she was the HOA, which earned her a raised eyebrow and a note scribbled onto a pad. That was the moment the crowd of neighbors realized this wasn't going her way. One neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, even chimed in, confirming she'd seen Keran snooping around other yards before. Another neighbor mentioned a time Keran tried to enter his shed to check for unapproved tools. Apparently, my cellar was just the first time someone had finally drawn a hard line. The officers separated us. I explained calmly that Keran had entered a locked structure without permission and refused to leave when asked. Keran, on the other hand, was unraveling. She accused me of entrapment. She accused the HOA of failing her. She even accused the police of siding with non-compliant homeowners. That didn't help her case. The lead officer informed Keran that she was being cited for trespassing and unlawful entry. No handcuffs, but the humiliation alone was nuclear. Keran's mouth opened and closed like a broken hinge as reality finally landed. Before leaving, the officer advised me to install a visible lock and suggested I file a formal complaint with the HOA and the city. He also mentioned that a restraining order might be worth considering if this behavior continued. As the patrol car pulled away, Keran stood frozen in the street, clutching her clipboard like it might save her. I locked the cellar door for good measure, then went back inside, knowing one thing for sure. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By Monday morning, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Screenshots flew back and forth like fireworks. Keran's version of events, my calmly worded clarification, and at least 3 eyewitness accounts that completely dismantled her narrative. Keran claimed she'd been conducting an emergency safety inspection and that I had unlawfully detained her. No one was buying it. The HOA board sent out a notice that afternoon announcing an emergency meeting. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Keran had dragged them into this mess, and now they were scrambling to contain it. I showed up to the meeting with a folder thick enough to qualify as a weapon. Inside were property records, email chains, HOA bylaws, police documentation, and a printed copy of the trespassing citation. The room buzzed when I walked in. Keran was already there, sitting stiffly with her arms crossed, her clipboard resting uselessly on the table. For once, she wasn't talking. The HOA president cleared his throat and began with a speech about community harmony and misunderstandings. I let him finish. Then I stood up and laid everything out, slowly, clearly, and without raising my voice. I explained how Keran had entered my property, how she'd ignored prior written notices, and how the police had confirmed she had no authority to do what she did. The mood shifted. One board member asked Keran directly if she had authorization. She mumbled something about precedent. Another asked if she had keys to other residents' properties. That question hit like a hammer. Keran refused to answer. That was when the board's legal advisor spoke up. He explained that the HOA could be held liable if board members or former ones engaged in unauthorized inspections or harassment. Faces went pale. Pens stopped moving. Keran finally snapped, launching into a rant about declining property values and people who don't respect rules. But instead of nods, she got silence. The president cut her off and announced that Keran was no longer welcome to represent the HOA in any capacity. Furthermore, a formal letter would be sent to all residents clarifying that no HOA member may enter private property without written permission. Then came the final blow. The board voted to issue Keran a cease and desist order. If she continued harassing residents, legal action would follow. Keran stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She looked around, waiting for support that never came. She left without another word. After the meeting, neighbors approached me quietly. Some thanked me. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. One even admitted Keran had been the reason they were planning to move. That was when I realized this wasn't just about a root cellar. It was about years of unchecked behavior finally meeting resistance. When I got home, I added a new lock to the cellar door and installed a small camera facing the path. Not because I was scared, but because I was prepared. Keran had lost power, but people like her don't let go easily, and I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. The next few weeks were unusually quiet. Too quiet. Keran stopped patrolling the sidewalks. No more clipboard sightings, no passive-aggressive notes taped to mailboxes. It was as if she'd vanished. But I knew better. People like Keran don't disappear. They retreat, regroup, and wait for another angle. That angle came in the form of a certified letter. Keran had filed a formal complaint against me, claiming emotional distress, unlawful confinement, and defamation. The irony was almost impressive. Thankfully, facts are stubborn things. I forwarded the letter straight to my attorney, who responded with a concise rebuttal backed by police reports, video footage, HOA documentation, and witness statements. Within days, Keran's complaint collapsed under its own weight. But that wasn't the end of it. The city followed up on the trespassing citation and expanded the investigation after learning Keran had attempted similar inspections on other properties. 2 more neighbors came forward. One claimed Keran had entered their backyard. Another said she'd tried to open a garage. The pattern was undeniable. Keran was fined and issued a formal warning. More importantly, she was barred from acting in any HOA-related enforcement role permanently. The HOA, desperate to repair its reputation, updated its bylaws to include explicit language about homeowner privacy and boundaries. They even hired a third-party management company, effectively ending the era of neighborhood vigilantes. Life slowly returned to normal. The root cellar became a strange point of pride. Neighbors joked about it. One even asked if I'd install a historical plaque. I declined, but I did share the story whenever new residents moved in, less as gossip and more as a reminder that boundaries matter. As for Keran, she still lives down the street. We've crossed paths a few times. She doesn't make eye contact anymore, no lectures, no notes, just silence. And honestly, that's the best outcome I could have hoped for. The camera by the cellar hasn't captured anything but squirrels and the occasional raccoon. The lock remains untouched. Every time I open that door, I remember the moment she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. I didn't set out to make an example of anyone. I just refused to be intimidated in my own home. And in doing so, I learned something important. Standing your ground doesn't require yelling, threats, or revenge. Sometimes all it takes is closing a door, making a phone call, and letting accountability do the rest. Because authority without permission is just trespassing. And consequences? They always find a way in. Enjoying this HOA unraveling story and how it all came back to consequences and boundaries? Subscribe to stick around for more real-life neighborhood drama, HOA overreach, and stories where accountability actually wins. If this one made you shake your head or smile, drop a like, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA or neighbor who went way too far?